What's this, kid? You must have entered first class by mistake. His voice was thick with condescension, a sneer forming at the corners of his mouth. This is for people who actually matter. You don't belong here. Her chest tightened. The sting of his words wasn't just in his blatant racism, it was in the dismissal of her very existence, the assumption that she, a 12-year-old black girl, didn't deserve the same respect or space as anyone else. She had faced discrimination before, but never like this. Never so openly. Her heart raced as she stood frozen in the aisle. The flight attendant was just a few steps away, but the sinking feeling in her gut told her what would happen next. This man, with his entitled smirk, would get away with it. No one would care about the girl who had worked so hard to prove her worth. She could already hear the voices in her head. She's too young. She's too black. She's not worth the trouble. Excuse me, that's my seat, she said, her voice steady, though her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The man scoffed and leaned back further, his feet up on the armrest, as if he owned the entire plane. Find another seat, little ape. There are plenty of seats for people like you, just not this one. Her mind raced. Was she really about to let this slide? Was she really about to give in to this blatant racism, this sense of superiority, this man felt just because of the color of her skin? But before she could respond, she heard a voice cut through the tension like a knife. It was the captain, standing at the front of the plane, his voice loud and firm. Is there a problem here? The man looked up, startled, but his arrogance didn't falter. Yeah, there's a problem. This kid thinks she owns this seat. His words dripped with disdain, oblivious to the storm of injustice he was stirring. Now, the flight had gone from an ordinary journey to a battleground. The girl was about to find out whether she would be invisible once more, or if the captain would be the one to finally challenge the privilege that this man so carelessly flaunted. What would happen next? Would the captain stand up for what was right, or would he let this racist man win once again? Have you ever faced a moment where someone assumed you didn't belong, just because of the color of your skin? Have you ever been made to feel small or insignificant, as if your worth was less than others? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Hyper Racism channel, where the truth always takes flight, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The young girl, whose name was Simone, had always carried herself with an air of quiet confidence. At just 12 years old, she had already made a name for herself in the business world, a self-taught coding prodigy and the CEO of her own startup. Simone's company, TechGenius, was quickly gaining traction in the tech industry, attracting investors and clients who believed in her innovative approach to solving tech problems. She'd spent years working late into the night, learning programming languages and honing her skills, all while balancing schoolwork and the pressures that came with being the youngest in the room. Her father, a former engineer who now worked as her business consultant, had instilled in her the importance of composure, of keeping a level head no matter what. You will face challenges no one else has to, he often said. But how you respond to those challenges is what will define you. And Simone had done just that. Her maturity far surpassed her age, a calm demeanor that earned her respect in boardrooms full of adults who would otherwise have looked down on a girl her age. On this particular day, as she boarded the luxury flight from New York to San Francisco, she was filled with a quiet excitement. This was her first time flying first class, a small but meaningful milestone in her career, a reminder that her hard work had paid off. Her seat, 1A, was a comfortable cocoon of leather and polished wood, complete with a blanket, pillow, and a personal monitor for entertainment. Simone settled into the seat, eager to catch up on some reading for her upcoming presentation. This flight was supposed to be a brief respite, a moment to relax before the whirlwind of meetings that awaited her. But as she had already experienced too many times in her short life, her peace was about to be shattered by the kind of entitlement only a few could understand. She had learned early on to tune out the noise, to let people's prejudices bounce off her like water on a duck's back. But this was different. This was not the subtle exclusion she had grown accustomed to, this was outright disregard. A white man in his mid-40s, comfortably settled into the seat that was rightfully hers. He was the kind of person who looked at Simone and immediately assumed she was out of place, as though she didn't belong in the world of luxury and business. The man was dressed in a tailored suit that clearly cost more than Simone's entire wardrobe. His hair was slicked back, and his cologne filled the air, overpowering the faint scent of the cabin. He was the kind of person who expected the world to cater to him, and in this moment he was oblivious to the young girl standing in front of him. His gaze never wavered from his phone as he leaned back in her seat, dismissing her with an almost imperceptible sneer. "This is my seat," he said, his voice dripping with entitlement. "Go find somewhere else to sit." Simone felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. She had seen this before, grown men assuming they could push her aside simply because of the color of her skin. But she wasn't just any 12-year-old girl. She was the CEO of TechGenius, and she wasn't going to let anyone belittle her. The journey to get here, to this moment, hadn't been easy, but she had made it. No one, least of all this man, was going to take that from her. "You're in my seat," she said, her voice calm but firm. The man, without missing a beat, rolled his eyes. "Look, kid, this is first class. Do you even know how to sit in first class?" His tone was condescending, as though Simone had no business being there. "This is for people who know what they're doing, not for whatever you are." Simone's eyes narrowed, but she kept her composure. This man didn't know her, didn't know the battles she had fought to get here. To him, she was just another black girl who didn't belong in a place like this. But to Simone, this seat wasn't just about comfort. It was about claiming what was rightfully hers, about not letting anyone define her worth based on her age or skin color. Her thoughts were interrupted when the flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, approached. She looked between Simone and the man, her eyes darting nervously. She had seen these types of situations before. She knew how this would play out, how the passengers who caused a scene were usually the ones who got their way. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," the attendant said hesitantly, glancing at Simone before turning to the man. "This seat is assigned to her." The man grunted, his annoyance palpable. "Well, I'm not moving. I've already settled in. The kid can sit somewhere else." Simone stood there for a moment, feeling a wave of anger rising in her chest. But then, just as she was about to speak, she heard a voice from the front of the plane. The captain, his voice booming across the cabin, said, "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" The man looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting any intervention. The flight attendant, caught between two sides, stammered, "There's been a misunderstanding, sir. The young lady is assigned to this seat." The captain's eyes locked onto the man's, a silent challenge passing between them. "I'm afraid you'll have to move, sir. We can't have you occupying someone else's seat, especially on a full flight. It's company policy." The man's face reddened with embarrassment, his bravado faltering for the first time. "What? You're going to make a scene over a seat?" He shot back, clearly not used to being called out. Simone's heart pounded as she watched the confrontation unfold. This was the moment. Would the captain back her up, or would this be another instance where her worth was overlooked? The man grumbled, but the tension in the air was palpable. Simone could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. Would he argue more, or would he finally accept his defeat? But Simone knew this moment would decide everything. If this man backed down, it wouldn't just be her victory, it would be a triumph for every young black girl who had ever been underestimated. Would the captain let the man have his way, or would Simone finally see the justice she had long fought for? This was just the beginning. The confrontation had only just begun, but the question lingered. Would Simone be seen, truly seen, for the person she was? Or would she, yet again, be invisible in the eyes of a system that favored those with privilege? Have you ever found yourself fighting to be heard, fighting against prejudice that's so deeply ingrained it feels impossible to overcome? Have you ever been in a position where your worth was questioned simply because of how you looked? Tell us your story in the comments. The man, now visibly irritated, glared at Simone, but she remained still, her posture unwavering. Despite the growing discomfort in the air, she didn't flinch. She knew she was right, and that was all that mattered. The tension in the cabin was thick, like a storm cloud just waiting to burst, but Simone refused to let herself be drawn into a confrontation she hadn't caused. She was calm, composed, the way she had been taught to be in every business meeting, every pitch, every moment when someone underestimated her. But the man? His frustration was mounting. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His voice, however, was growing louder, filling the cabin. "I don't know why they let kids like you on these flights. Should be a rule. You need to have a reason to be in first class." Simone's heart thudded in her chest. His words weren't just rude, they were cruel. And there it was, the heart of the problem. It wasn't the seat. It wasn't the flight. It was that he couldn't stand seeing her, a young black girl, in a space he felt was reserved for people like him. People who looked like him. People who had money, power, and influence. People who were allowed to be where they were because of their skin color, their privilege. Simone held her breath, her mind racing. Should she argue back? Should she let him have it, call him out for what he truly was? But no. Her father's voice echoed in her head, reminding her that her composure, her dignity, were more valuable than any insult. Stay calm, Simone. Always stay calm. But as the seconds dragged on, the tension didn't dissipate. It only grew heavier. The man's eyes narrowed as he looked her over again, his sneer deepening. "You think you belong here, don't you?" he asked, louder this time, a taunt in his voice. "Just because they give you a seat in first class doesn't mean you belong here. People like you, kids like you, shouldn't be taking up space in places like this." Simone's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain composed. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her now. Some were uncomfortable, and others were whispering. She could almost hear their thoughts. What's going to happen next? Is she going to let him talk to her like that? They were watching, waiting for her to crack. Waiting for her to lose her cool. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. "I belong here," Simone finally said, her voice low but firm. "I worked hard to get here. I earned this seat, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me I don't." The man let out a derisive laugh, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held. "You think you earned this seat? You think just because you're a little smart, you can come in here and take it from someone who worked for it? You don't even know how to appreciate luxury. Kids like you, they're nothing but distractions." His words, sharp and full of venom, cut through the cabin, and for a moment, Simone felt the weight of them. He was right about one thing. She was different. Different from every person who had ever looked down on her, underestimated her, or written her off simply because of her race. But she wasn't going to back down. "You don't get to decide where I belong," she said, her voice now steady, unwavering. "Not you. Not anyone." The man shifted in his seat again, his jaw clenched, clearly annoyed at the girl's unshakable calmness. He stood up suddenly, his movements jerky with frustration. "You're a little brat. You don't know anything about real work, about earning your place in the world. You don't belong here, and you're not going to get away with it." Simone stayed seated, her hands clasped together in her lap, her back straight. She was no stranger to people like him, the ones who believed the world owed them something just because of their skin color, their gender, their perceived social status. But she wasn't just anyone. She was Simone Williams, the youngest CEO in her industry. She had faced far worse than this. "Let's settle this once and for all," the man sneered, stepping closer. "You're not taking my seat. You're not even supposed to be here. Now get out of my way before I—" Before he could finish, the captain's voice rang out, this time sharp and unyielding, cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. "That's enough." Simone's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment. The moment when someone would finally stand up to this man. And now, it seemed, the moment had come. The captain, a tall man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood at the front of the plane, his gaze unwavering as he looked directly at the man who had been causing all the trouble. "You will sit down now. You will not speak to her that way, and you will not make another scene on this flight." The man's face flushed red, and for a split second, Simone saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected the captain to intervene. He had expected the flight crew to back him up, to protect his comfort, his privilege. But the captain wasn't having it. "Or what?" the man growled, his voice a low rumble, clearly not backing down. or I will have you escorted off this flight at the next stop, the captain said, his voice cold, final. You can either sit down and apologize to the young lady, or you can face the consequences of your actions. Simone held her breath, waiting. Would this man, this arrogant, entitled man, finally back down? Would he see that his behavior was unacceptable, that his privilege didn't make him untouchable? The seconds ticked by, the tension unbearable. Simone could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, on them, waiting for the man's next move. What would he do? Would he walk away, or would he continue to challenge the authority of the captain, the system that was finally, in this moment, working for her? What happened next would change everything. Would he stand down, or would the battle between entitlement and justice play out in front of an audience that would never forget what happened on this flight? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand up against someone's privilege, their blatant disregard for your dignity? When was the last time you were tested like that? How did you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The captain's voice hung in the air, sharp and unwavering, and for a moment, everything fell silent. The white man stood there, hands still clenched at his sides, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. The tension in the cabin was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Everyone was watching. Simone could feel their eyes on her, and she wondered, just for a brief second, if this was the moment that would define her. But as she stood there, holding her ground, she felt an unfamiliar rush of power surge through her. The man, still stubborn, sneered at the captain. I don't take orders from anyone, he muttered under his breath, his jaw locked tight in defiance. But the captain didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. You do now, the captain said, his voice still calm but laced with authority. You've made your choice. Now, I'm making mine. Simone watched the exchange with quiet intensity, but she knew this wasn't over. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about something far bigger. The injustice of this moment was symbolic of the world she had been trying to change. She had worked so hard to prove herself, and yet here she was, still being judged based on nothing but the color of her skin. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, something shifted in the man's demeanor. His bravado started to crack, and his defiance wavered. He looked around the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers. Some were watching with quiet judgment, others with curiosity. But what he saw in their eyes wasn't the support he expected. It wasn't the sympathy he thought he'd get from being the victim of a young girl confronting him. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. His smugness, his sense of entitlement, all of it was crumbling under the pressure of a reality he had never had to face. This wasn't just some kid sitting in a seat she didn't deserve. This was a challenge to everything he believed in, everything he took for granted. His privilege. His comfort. He believed that he could get away with anything because of who he was. Simone's heart raced, but she knew this was the moment. This was the time when she would stop letting the world define her, stop letting people like him decide her worth. She had spent her whole life trying to earn respect, to prove herself worthy of spaces that had never been meant for her. But this wasn't about proving anything to him. This was about standing up for herself, for every young person who had ever been told they didn't belong. I think you've made your point, the man said, his voice now tinged with frustration. But as he reached for his things, Simone saw it, the brief flicker of fear in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. And it was the opening she needed. I don't think you understand, Simone said, her voice low, yet carrying across the cabin. She had been calm up until now, but the words came out sharper this time, filled with the weight of everything she had fought for. I don't need to take your seat to prove anything to you. I don't need your permission to exist in this space. The man froze, his hands still gripping his bag. For a moment, he looked like he didn't know what to say. But Simone wasn't done. You think I don't belong here? That's fine. But what you don't know is that I'm the CEO of TechGenius. My company is worth millions. I've built it from the ground up. And I'm here on this flight because I earned it, every step of the way. The man blinked, the color draining from his face. He stared at her, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes. There was no sense of superiority. Only disbelief. And then, in an instant, it hit him. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she was just some kid, just another black girl who didn't know her place. But he was wrong. Simone wasn't just anyone. She was a force to be reckoned with. The cabin fell silent again. The flight attendants, who had been standing off to the side, watching the exchange with wide eyes, glanced at each other in stunned silence. They knew Simone's name. They knew the TechGenius brand. It was a well-known startup, growing at an exponential rate. Investors were watching it closely. The tech world was taking notice of Simone's genius. And now, here she was, revealing her true identity to everyone who had doubted her. She wasn't just a girl in first class. She was a CEO. She was a young black woman who had shattered the expectations placed on her, who had fought for every ounce of success she had earned. The man's face was a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "You're Simone Williams?" he stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Simone said, cutting him off, her voice now cold with the weight of truth. "You never thought someone like me could make it here, did you? You thought I didn't belong. But now, the world knows who I am, and you're just another person who had to learn the hard way." The flight attendants exchanged a quick look, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. No one had expected this. No one had expected a 12-year-old black girl to stand up to a grown man, a man who had assumed his privilege could silence her. But in that moment, Simone had shifted the power dynamic completely. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was showing him, and everyone else, how wrong they were. The man opened his mouth to say something, but the words died on his tongue. His face flushed with a mix of frustration and humiliation. The captain stood firm at the front of the plane, arms crossed, waiting for the man to make his next move. Simone could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, but she didn't care. She had earned her place here. She had earned the right to exist in any space she chose. And no one, especially not a man like this, would take that from her. For a moment, it seemed like the man was going to explode with anger, but instead, he simply grabbed his things, muttered something unintelligible under his breath, and stormed down the aisle, leaving Simone alone in the seat he had tried to steal. Simone exhaled a shaky breath, the adrenaline rushing through her veins. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about every time someone had underestimated her, every time someone had tried to erase her worth. She had made her mark today, but there was still so much more to prove. The captain, still standing at the front, gave her a small nod of approval. "You're a brave young lady," he said quietly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Simone smiled, her heart still racing. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But what would happen next? Would the man try to retaliate? Would there be more to this confrontation than Simone could handle? The flight was far from over, and the journey she was on had just taken a dramatic turn. The flight had barely settled back into its rhythm when the storm of tension that had hung in the air finally began to break. The man, who had been so sure of his superiority just moments ago, now seemed to shrink under the weight of his own humiliation. But that didn't stop his temper from flaring. Simone sat in her seat, her heart still pounding from the intense exchange. She was proud of herself, of how she'd stood her ground. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. She could sense the man's fury simmering beneath the surface, could feel the hostile energy he was projecting across the aisle. As the minutes passed, Simone tried to focus on the book she had been reading before the altercation. But she couldn't ignore the man's glare burning into the back of her head. He was fuming, no longer hiding his disdain. Simone didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She had earned this seat, and she wasn't going to let him take it from her. Not now, not ever. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey, you think you can just come in here and show off your money, your little tech company?" The words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Simone's breath caught in her throat as she turned to see the man now standing up, his face a deep shade of crimson, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. He was no longer trying to keep his anger in check. He was shouting now, drawing the attention of the surrounding passengers. "People like you don't belong in first class," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "I worked for what I have. I didn't have things handed to me, like you did. What are you, a little rich kid trying to prove something? You think just because you're the CEO of some company, you can take whatever you want. Simone's pulse quickened, but she remained calm, unshaken. His words didn't hit her like they used to hit others. She had heard it all before. She was used to being underestimated. But this time, it wasn't just a slight, it was an attack. And this time, she wasn't going to back down. The surrounding passengers had begun to take notice of the scene unfolding. Some were already whispering to one another, their eyes darting nervously between the man and Simone. A few were already reaching for their phones, recording the escalating confrontation. Others remained silent, unsure of what to do or whether to get involved. Simone's heart beat faster, but she didn't show it. She held his gaze, her hands still resting on her lap, every inch of her body radiating calmness. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative. "You don't get to speak to me like that," Simone said, her voice steady and cool. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you. I came here to do my job, like everyone else. I'm not the one who's acting entitled, you are." The man took a step forward, his chest puffing out with anger. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. "You think you're something special? You think you're above everyone else? You're just a kid, a spoiled little brat who doesn't even know what it's like to earn something the right way." The tension in the air became palpable, thick enough to choke on. The flight attendants looked on, but none of them moved to intervene. Simone could feel the pressure building, like a ticking time bomb about to go off. She had to be careful now. This man was losing control. His words, his actions were no longer measured, they were reckless. Simone leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving his. "You have no idea what I've been through. You have no idea how hard I've worked to get here, to earn everything I have. You don't get to tell me I don't belong." The man was now seething. His face twisted with rage, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "You're nothing. You're just a little black girl who thinks she can play with the big leagues. You're out of your depth. You'll never be one of us." Simone's chest tightened at his words, but she refused to let them get to her. This was exactly the kind of prejudice she had spent her whole life fighting against. The belief that people like her didn't deserve the same spaces, the same opportunities as others. But she wouldn't let him break her. She wouldn't let him drag her down to his level. Before she could respond, the man did something that made everyone in the cabin hold their breath. He lunged toward her, his hands reaching out as if to grab her by the shoulders and drag her out of her seat. But before he could touch her, the captain, who had been standing at the front, moved with surprising speed. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice like a thunderclap that reverberated through the cabin. The man stopped dead in his tracks, his hands still outstretched but now trembling with rage. The captain didn't hesitate. "You are getting off this flight. Now." The man's face contorted with disbelief. "What? You can't." "I can," the captain interrupted firmly. "You've crossed the line. You're making the passengers uncomfortable, and I'm not going to let you make a scene any longer." But before the captain could take further action, the tension in the cabin exploded. The man, his eyes wild with fury, turned to the other passengers, his voice rising. "You're all cowards," he yelled. "You're all standing by, letting this little girl, dictate what happens on this plane?" Simone's stomach dropped. The man's voice was growing louder, more erratic, and she could feel the eyes of every passenger on her now. They were watching, waiting. But Simone didn't flinch. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. And then, in a move that took everyone by surprise, the man reached into his bag and pulled out something that gleamed in the light. A phone. But it wasn't just any phone. It was a phone with a live feed open, aimed directly at Simone. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, his finger poised over the record button. "I'm going to show the world who you really are." Simone's breath caught in her throat. Was he really going to do this? Was he going to try to ruin her reputation, to paint her as the aggressor in this situation? But before he could press the button, a voice rang out from the back of the plane, clear and strong. "Not so fast." Everyone turned to see another passenger, an older woman in a suit, standing up. She was calm, collected, but there was fire in her eyes. "This isn't your plane, and you're not in charge here." the woman said, her voice carrying authority. "I think you need to sit down, apologize, and leave that girl alone." The man froze, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the words. But none came. The passengers who had been silently watching the confrontation now began murmuring in agreement. The tide was shifting. The support for the man was fading, replaced by a growing sense of unity. Simone's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't dare look away. Was this really happening? Was he finally going to back down? Or was the storm about to hit again, harder than ever? The atmosphere was electric with tension, but one thing was certain: the stakes had never been higher. And the outcome? Well, that was still hanging in the balance. Have you ever had someone try to turn the tables on you, manipulate the situation to make you look like the villain? How did you fight back? Let us know in the comments below. The cabin was eerily silent now, the weight of what was unfolding settling over every passenger like a heavy blanket. Simone could feel the shift in the air. The tide was turning, quickly, and she wasn't the only one who noticed it. The passengers, once mere bystanders to the escalating confrontation, were now leaning forward in their seats, their eyes glued to the drama playing out before them. The man, who had once seemed untouchable, was now visibly floundering, his face twisted with anger and confusion. The older woman who had stepped in on Simone's behalf had made a bold statement. Her voice had carried through the cabin, unwavering, forcing the other passengers to take sides. The man, once so sure of his position, was losing ground by the second. Simone could see the panic beginning to take root in his eyes. He was no longer in control. He was no longer the man who could dictate the terms of this situation. He was exposed, vulnerable, and there was no turning back now. Simone remained seated, her back straight, her eyes locked onto him with unyielding determination. She had fought so hard for this moment. She had endured years of being overlooked, dismissed, and belittled. But today, in this cabin, in front of these strangers, she would not be silenced. She would not be intimidated. And this man, this arrogant, entitled man, was going to learn that there were consequences for his actions. The flight attendant, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward cautiously. Her eyes flicked between Simone and the man, her hands wringing together nervously. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane. You've already caused a disturbance, and your behavior is unacceptable." The man turned on her, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're going to throw me off this flight?" he snarled, his voice rising. "Do you know who I am? I'm a paying customer. You can't just—" But the flight attendant, now emboldened by the support of the other passengers, didn't back down. "We can and we will," she said, her voice firming up with each word. "You've broken the rules, and now there will be consequences." Simone's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the man's expression shift from rage to disbelief. The captain, still standing at the front, had already made the call. The man was about to be escorted off the plane, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Simone knew this was the moment when everything would change. The scales were tipping and there was no going back. The man's hands trembled as he reached for his phone again, his fingers flying over the screen in a desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "You don't know who you're messing with," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I'll have you all fired. I'll make sure you regret this." But Simone was done listening. She was done being the silent, obedient child he expected her to be. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and endured too much to let him walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. "You've already lost," Simone said, her voice carrying across the cabin, calm and steady, like the sound of a judge's gavel striking down a final verdict. "You're not in charge here. You're not in control anymore. And no matter how many times you threaten us, you're not going to intimidate me or anyone else on this flight." The man stopped typing, his fingers stilling over the phone's screen as he turned to face her. His eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, he saw the truth. The quiet confidence that radiated from Simone wasn't something he could destroy. He could try to belittle her. He could try to humiliate her. But in the end, it was his privilege, his sense of entitlement, that would be shattered. The captain's voice cut through the tension again. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time to gather your things and step off the plane. We don't tolerate this behavior here. Your actions have caused enough disruption. Now, please leave." The man's face was a mix of humiliation and rage as he grabbed his bag and stood up. He stormed toward the front of the plane, muttering curses under his breath, but not before throwing one final glance back at Simone. His eyes, filled with venom, locked onto her for just a moment. But Simone wasn't intimidated. She held his gaze, unwavering. As he walked past her, the man's steps faltered for a brief second, and in that moment, the power shifted. He had lost. The other passengers, who had been silent spectators until now, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some nodded in approval, others exchanged glances, but all of them shared one undeniable truth. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A young girl, a 12-year-old girl, had just stood up to a grown man, a man who thought he could get away with belittling her. And she had won. The flight attendant, a small smile creeping across her face, turned to Simone. "Thank you," she said softly. "That took a lot of courage." Simone smiled, but her heart was still racing. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or disregarded because of who they were. Today, she had made a statement, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were. The captain nodded at her from the front of the plane. "You handled that like a true professional," he said, his voice warm with approval. "I don't think anyone expected that today." Simone's chest swelled with pride, but there was no time to bask in the victory. The flight was still in the air, and she still had a long road ahead of her. But one thing had changed. She was no longer just a 12-year-old girl in a first-class seat. She was a force to be reckoned with. A young black girl who had shown the world that she wasn't going to be intimidated. But as the flight continued, Simone couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There were still battles to fight, still people who would try to tear her down, still prejudices to overcome. She had won today, but what would tomorrow bring? And as the plane soared higher, Simone's thoughts drifted to the future. What would she do next? Would this victory be enough to change minds, to break down barriers? Or would she have to keep fighting, keep proving herself, every step of the way? One thing was for certain, Simone was just getting started. As the man stormed off the plane, his face a mask of rage and humiliation, Simone sat back in her seat, finally allowing herself to exhale. Her body was still trembling from the tension, but the weight that had been pressing down on her since the moment she stepped onto the plane had lifted. She had done it. She had stood up for herself, and she had won. The captain, the flight attendants, and even the passengers around her were witnesses to what had just unfolded. A young black girl, unwavering in her calm, standing up to a man who thought his privilege would shield him from accountability. The flight continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of conversation had faded, replaced by a quiet reverence. Some passengers offered her smiles of approval. Others nodded, acknowledging the courage it took for someone so young to confront such blatant racism in a public space. It wasn't just a victory for Simone, it was a reminder to everyone on that flight that injustice couldn't be allowed to stand unchecked. As the plane touched down in San Francisco, Simone felt the weight of her victory settle in. The man had been escorted off, his name and actions likely reported to his company. He was no longer the untouchable figure who could walk over people without consequences. And he knew it. Simone knew she had done more than reclaim a seat, she had reclaimed her dignity. She had proven to everyone on that plane, and to herself, that standing up for what's right could change the course of a situation. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to lose her composure. She only needed to be who she was, a force to be reckoned with. When the flight had landed, the captain's words came over the loudspeaker. "We've landed safely in San Francisco, and we'd like to thank all our passengers for their patience during today's events. Rest assured, the matter with the disruptive passenger has been resolved, and we will take further actions as necessary." Simone knew that the man's actions wouldn't go unpunished. His company, or someone in his circle, would learn about what he'd done. He would face consequences, just as he should. Whether he was fired, publicly shamed, or forced to reckon with his behavior in some other way, Simone didn't know. But one thing was clear, He would no longer be able to walk through life thinking he could treat people like Simone with such utter disregard. For Simone, the most powerful part of this victory wasn't just that he had been humiliated. It was that she had been heard. The world had seen her stand tall against injustice. She had used her voice to shift the power dynamics, and now that man, who had once held all the cards, was left with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. Simone glanced out the window as the plane taxied toward the gate, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment settle in her chest. She had done what many adults, what many people, couldn't do. She had fought back against discrimination and emerged victorious, all while maintaining the poise and dignity that would carry her far beyond this moment. But as she stood to collect her belongings, her mind raced forward to what came next. What other battles would she face? What other injustices would she have to confront? The flight had ended, but her journey was far from over. And as she stepped off the plane into the bright California sunshine, Simone couldn't help but wonder, what was next for her? Do you think standing up to racism always leads to justice being served? Or do we sometimes just have to keep fighting for our voices to be heard? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to confront someone who thought they were above you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As Simone walked down the jet bridge, her steps were slow but purposeful. The bustling noise of the airport filled her ears, but her mind was far from the crowded terminals, far from the clatter of rolling suitcases and announcements overhead. Her thoughts were still with the flight, the confrontation, the tension, and the sense of power she had felt when she stood her ground. She had done it. She had faced down a man who thought his privilege gave him the right to belittle her, to dismiss her, and to take something that wasn't his. And she stood tall, calm, composed. In doing so, Simone had not only taken back what was rightfully hers, but she had also challenged a system that often allowed people like him to get away with injustice. The memory of his face, flushed with embarrassment as the flight attendants escorted him off the plane, still lingered in her mind. The way he had tried to tear her down with words, the way he had assumed she wasn't capable of standing up for herself simply because of her age and skin color. But what hurt more than his words was the truth that lay beneath them. He didn't believe she belonged in that space. And that was a truth that weighed heavily on her. Not because of the injustice of his words, but because of the countless times people like her, people of color, had been made to feel like they didn't belong. She wasn't just fighting for herself on that plane. She was fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. Simone had come to realize something during that flight, that injustice, whether it was blatant or subtle, could be fought with dignity. It didn't always require shouting or losing composure. It didn't always mean being loud to be heard. Sometimes, the loudest statement you could make was the one where you stood in your truth, unwavering, calm, and strong. And that, she knew, was the most powerful form of resistance. Reflecting on the events, Simone felt a rush of gratitude for the lessons that had shaped her into the person she had become. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the reminder that how she responded to challenges would define her more than the challenges themselves. She had always tried to hold her head high, always tried to see the bigger picture, even when people tried to force her into smaller boxes. And today, she had done just that. Simone knew this victory wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't have a voice, like they couldn't fight back against the forces that tried to keep them down. The world wasn't fair. It was filled with biases, prejudices, and systemic inequalities. But that didn't mean the fight wasn't worth it. Every person who stood up, whether in a small moment like this one or in the face of larger systemic issues, contributed to the broader movement toward equality and justice. And that was where the real lesson lay. People could make a difference. Every action, no matter how small it seemed in the grand scheme of things, mattered. Simone had stood up in a moment of racial discrimination, but every person who had ever faced similar adversity had the power to stand tall, too. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being brave. It was about knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. The day had given Simone a new sense of clarity. The fight for racial justice could not be won in a single battle or on a single plane. It was a continuous struggle, a fight that took place in boardrooms, classrooms, streets, and even the quiet corners of the world where injustice sometimes hid in plain sight. But as she walked through the airport, she felt more determined than ever. She had seen firsthand what it felt like to reclaim your power, to take a stand when the world expected you to shrink. It was a feeling that couldn't be taken from her, not by anyone. Simone's thoughts were interrupted as she neared the baggage claim. The faint buzz of the airport's announcements, the murmur of passengers around her, it all felt like a distant hum now. She wasn't just a 12-year-old girl anymore. She was a young woman, a voice in a world that too often tried to silence people like her. As she picked up her bag, she thought about the future, about all the places she would go, all the battles she would face, and all the people she would help along the way. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. And so, as Simone stepped into the bright, warm sunlight of San Francisco, she knew that this fight, the fight for justice, for racial equality, and for the right to be seen and heard, would continue. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were. Simone had learned that it wasn't enough to be quiet in the face of injustice. The world would never change if people stayed silent. Change came from the people who were brave enough to speak up, to stand tall, and to show the world that they wouldn't back down, no matter what. She had made her mark on the world today. And now, she was ready to make a difference, one step at a time. The consequences for the man didn't end when he was escorted off that plane. Simone would later learn, through whispers among the passengers and murmurs at the gate, that his outburst hadn't gone unnoticed by the wider world. Several passengers had recorded the entire confrontation on their phones, capturing every word, every sneer, every moment he had tried to demean a 12-year-old black CEO who had done nothing but claim the seat she had earned. By the time the plane landed, the clips had already begun circulating online. Within hours, hashtags were trending. Hashtag justice for Simone, hashtag privilege exposed, hashtag racism in first class. The man's face, once flushed with arrogance, was now plastered across the internet for millions to see. It wasn't long before the fallout began. The man, identified as a senior executive at a financial firm in Chicago, faced immediate backlash. His company, already under scrutiny for diversity issues, couldn't afford the scandal. They issued a public statement denouncing his behavior, promising a thorough review of his conduct. Behind closed doors, the decision came swiftly: termination. His years of climbing the corporate ladder unraveled in a single night. His name became synonymous with entitlement and racism, and his career, once stable and respected, was suddenly in ruins. Meanwhile, Simone's calm defiance became the centerpiece of the story. Reporters highlighted her composure, her poise, and the courage it took to stand up to someone who had underestimated her simply because of her age and race. Her company, TechGenius, saw a surge of attention. Investors who had once hesitated now saw in her not just a brilliant mind, but a leader with resilience. Parents wrote to her, thanking her for showing their children what it meant to stand tall in the face of prejudice. Students quoted her words on social media, using them as fuel to face their own battles in classrooms, playgrounds, and boardrooms. The other passengers from that flight, too, carried the memory with them. Many admitted later that they had been complicit in their silence at first, watching but not intervening. Simone's bravery stirred something in them. Some wrote online that they regretted not speaking up sooner, but vowed never to stay silent again if they saw someone treated unjustly. What began as an ugly confrontation in a cramped airplane cabin had become a spark, igniting conversations about racism, privilege, and who belongs in spaces that too often exclude. But Simone herself didn't celebrate with fireworks or speeches. Her reflection remained steady. This was just one victory in a much larger fight. The humiliation of one man was not the end goal. It was the ripple effect, the conversations it forced, the uncomfortable truths it exposed, that mattered most. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of vindication that washed over her when she heard the news. He had tried to strip her of her dignity, but in the end, he had stripped himself of his reputation. And yet, in that quiet moment as she prepared for her upcoming presentation in San Francisco, Simone couldn't help but wonder how many others like him were still out there. How many others would try to silence, dismiss, or belittle her? This was not the end of her journey. If anything, it was just the beginning. The world had seen her now, and there would be more eyes on her, more expectations, and perhaps more resistance. The question remained, would she be ready for the next battle? Simone stood at the edge of the airport terminal, her eyes gazing out at the bustling scene before her. The noise, the hurried footsteps, the chatter, all of it felt distant now, almost surreal. She had just experienced something that would forever alter the course of her life, and yet, she felt a strange sense of calm. The world had watched as she stood up to someone who tried to diminish her, and in doing so, she had done more than just defend a seat, she had defended her dignity, and with it, a larger principle of justice. Her heart still raced with the intensity of the confrontation, but the weight of what had happened was starting to settle. She had become more than just a young CEO. In those moments on the flight, she had become a symbol, a reminder that no one, no matter their privilege or status, was above being held accountable for their actions. Simone's quiet strength had proven that one voice could shift the power dynamic. Her composure had defied the stereotypes that so often worked against her. But as the days passed, Simone couldn't ignore the deeper truth. This was not a singular victory. It was a ripple in a much larger wave, a shift that could only grow stronger if others were brave enough to follow her lead. People had shared their stories with her, stories of their own encounters with prejudice, discrimination, and injustice. They had been inspired by her, but now it was her turn to stay inspired by them. Her fight wasn't over, it had just begun. The aftermath of that day had sparked something in Simone. It wasn't just about the public shaming of one man, it was about the cultural shift that could take place when people stood up for fairness and equality. The world had witnessed what could happen when someone used their voice to challenge what was wrong. It was a reminder that, though change might come slowly, it was possible. Every conversation, every act of resistance, every choice to stand tall made a difference. Simone's journey had led her here, but it was far from over. She would continue to face challenges, some big, some small, but each one would make her stronger. She now knew that her voice mattered, and that speaking out against injustice wasn't just a one-time event, it was a responsibility, an ongoing mission. And so, she would keep pushing forward, knowing that every step, no matter how small, was a step toward creating a world where everyone had an equal chance to be seen, heard, and respected. Thank you for watching. If you believe in fairness and equality, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Simone's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters too. Let's keep this conversation going.